In this tutorial, we're going to go through a number of different ways that you could have approached the animation project, because there are no preset rules about how you might want to approach these things. So in this example, you can see that instead of creating two scenes perpendicular to each other, I've just created one in front of the other. But there's a little bit more going on too. So you can see in the background, I've added a black image just to create a fully black outline in this entire background. Now, if I select the camera, you'll notice that I've activated camera effects. And in the camera effects, I have changed the field of view. So when I go to my camera, you'll notice that it was a bit more zoomed in. And that just gives me the ability to have a little bit more parallax, a little bit more of this movement effect that we're looking for. So you can see that because I've got a narrower field of view, I have been able to push these objects further apart. And that means that I can have a little bit more parallax in the system when I animate it. And because I've laid these out end on end, what I've decided to do is not do that jump technique that we went through in the previous tutorial. I actually go directly through the image. And that just creates a little bit of a dynamic feel. But you can see because I've got this longer or this narrower field of view, I can create a lot more parallax and there's a lot more movement between the images. So that's a different approach that you could have. But you'll also notice as I go through this image that the button appears. So here we have some animated effects where the button was hidden and then its opacity changes and it appears when I want it to. So you can actually also have a number of different techniques that actually allow the system to have a bit more dynamic feel, where you actually animate the properties of the objects, not just the camera. Now you might have looked at that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles example where the images are cut out and laid on a plane. And you might like that effect and want to achieve it. In Vortals, you have to do this in a very particular way, because Vortals is based on game engine technology. And because of that, when you load an image, you'll find some really weird effects that were unexpected. And there's a different approach that you have to have in order to account for this unusual effect. So first I'm going to load in this background. And the background has loaded, but at the moment you can't see it. Now if I rotate the camera, you'll see it sort of start to appear, which is a bit confusing. Now if I move it back here and lift it up a bit, suddenly the whole image is there. And this might confuse you when you first start. And then if I load in our kangaroo image, once again the kangaroo image has loaded. But as I move it, you'll see that the kangaroo image disappears when the center of the image is below the ground plane image, and it reappears when the center of the image is above the ground plane image, rather than parts of the image being shown or hidden. All of this means that using an image to create this effect is not a technique that will work. And so what I'm going to do now is take you through the process of how to achieve this effect using a different method. Now I've loaded up a program called Blender. Blender is a free 3D program. And all I've done is I've started a new project. I've gone to Add Mesh and Add a Plane. And I've rotated the plane until it's facing a direction. Now you don't need to do that. You can simply load this plane as you want. But I've decided to do it like that. I'm going to choose File, Export, and Export FBX. And then I'm going to save it to a location. And now that I've exported this, instead of loading an image, I'm going to load a 3D model. First, I'm going to delete our images. So we're going to load in a 3D model. And it's the model that we've exported from Blender. And so now I've loaded in this 3D plane. Now, you might load it in and find it as loaded in backwards, and so you can't see anything. So just be aware that planes are directional, and you might find that what you've loaded in has loaded in backwards. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set this plane as my initial ground plane. And I'm going to come up here to Color Image, and I'm going to add the image that I would have loaded through the image loading process, but now I've done so through the 3D model process. And now I'm going to load in the background. So again, I'm going to load in the plane. And now you can see the plane loads in as you would expect it, rather than the confusing way it did with the image. I'm going to load in the background image. And again, you can see that this is working as you would expect it, rather than through the image technique. And now I'm going to load in another plane. And to this plane, I'm going to change from fast shader to basic shader. Now this is a very important step in the process. And I'm going to choose color image. And I'm going to choose my foreground kangaroo image. And it's loaded in upside down, so I'm going to rotate it. And I might scale it down. And so now we have this cutout effect that's working properly and as expected, unlike when we had the images. Now I have spent a little bit of time on this scene, and what I've done is I've created an animated camera path through our cutouts that we've loaded. But what you'll notice is that I've activated camera effects. And in these camera effects, I've got a whole bunch of different options. I've activated depth of field, I've activated chromatic aberration, and a whole bunch of different effects. We can animate these effects. So if I go to my camera view, you'll see immediately that some of the effects have been applied. So let me animate that and let's have a look at what it looks like. And so you can see I've got a bit of an effect. It's not quite working like I wanted to, and I now want to edit those keyframes. There are a couple of ways that you can do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my camera view and I'm going to choose Edit Keyframes. This has now taken me to the first keyframe that the camera has. But if I want to actually edit these values, I have to choose Edit Keyframe Values. And this has now taken me to that camera position and it's showing me what these values are actually doing to the camera. So I might want to adjust my field of view, for example, and my depth of field. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to adjust my chromatic aberration. And I don't like my camera vignette, so I'm going to reduce that as well. And my bloom I'm not particularly happy with. And now I want to move on to this next keyframe. And to do that, what I'm going to do is click on this button here. And this has now taken me forward to that keyframe. If I choose back, I go back to the original. And so now you can see that these keyframe effects are different on each one. So the camera is adjusting to each of those. And now, if I remove the edit keyframe and I start playing the animation, you'll see that the animation is transferring from one set of keyframe values to the next, and it's creating this animated effect on the camera. Now you don't need to go to the camera, select animation, and select edit keyframes each time. You can individually select the keyframe. You can choose the edit keyframe values, and you can modify all of these values. The problem you'll have with that is that you won't actually be able to see what the camera is seeing because you're not in the camera view mode. That might not be a problem depending on what you're doing, but just be aware that that is one of the issues you'll face. Now the last thing to think about is instead of animating the camera, maybe you could actually animate the cutouts themselves. So here I'm adding some keyframes and moving our cutouts into this scene. And you can see this replicated in, again, some of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle example that we showed, where the actual cutouts were moved and animated themselves. So you don't have to be limited to only moving the camera. You can move the camera, you can move your cutouts, you can animate your camera effects. There's a whole bunch of ways that you can approach making a dynamic scene.